Hello, welcome to the webinar. My name is Jimmy Hinchliffe and I chair the England and Wales chapter of the Institute of Operational Risk. And this will be what we hope will be the first in a series of webinars. And today's topic is everyone's favorite topic at the moment, COVID-19, Black Swan or Grey Rhino, Lessons for Risk Management. And I will say right at the start that we're not planning today to have some kind of esoteric or theoretical discussion around this, but we really want to focus on what are the lessons of the COVID-19 experience for risk management. And it's really the new buzzword, the new normal. And we want to explore as well, what does it actually mean for risk management, almost what is the new normal for risk management. Now, in terms of the Institute of Operational Risk, hopefully most of you have heard of the Institute and are aware of it, but the Institute was set up in 2004, seems like a very long time ago now, and it's the only professional institute dedicated solely to operational risk. Actually, last year, the Institute became part of the Institute of Risk Management. So we're now part of that wider group, which is really great. And some of the things we do, so we have a professional qualification in operational risk, which is the certificate in operational risk, the CORM. And we run a lot of events. So last year within England and Wales, we ran 9 events plus the Christmas drinks. And so I would definitely recommend that if you're not a member, check out the website and you'll see there details on what we do and you get information on joining. So as I said at the start, this will hopefully be the first in a series of webinars, and we plan to do them probably every 4 or 5 weeks. And the next webinar will be probably in mid-June. We're just firming up the date, and that will be on the hotter topic of operational resilience. So we hope you can join that. We'll obviously be promoting that soon, and then we have a couple of more webinars also in the working in the design stage. I should also add that as well as the webinars, we normally do longer events, which normally we do is obviously physical events, and the next one of those was due to be on the 29th of June, which was on risk governance oversight. And nationwide, we're very kindly due to host that. Obviously, in the circumstances with the lockdown and what have you, we're going to have to do that as a virtual event. So we'll be also promoting that soon. So please watch out for that. And hopefully,
I didn't catch that.
Hopefully you can make it along to there. So in terms of today's webinar, so we have a fantastic set of speakers today, and they're all IOR fellows, which is really good. And we actually have one former chairman of the institute, that's Simon. So in terms of their profiles, I'll just give a very brief introduction to each of our speakers today, and then we'll kick off with today's webinar. So Andrew Sheen, obviously best known for his time at the UK regulators, firstly at the FSA, where I had the pleasure of working with him, and then at the PRA, focusing very much on operational risk policy, and then as an SME supporting supervisors. And then after Andrew left the regulator, he then had roles at the HSBC and at the Credit Suisse. And then on his retirement, unlike most people who might relax on the golf course, he set up his own consultancy to do operational risk consulting and training. And as I say, he's a fellow of the IOR. Ariane Chappelle is an internationally recognized trainer and consultant in operational risk, and former holder of the chair of international finance at the University of Brussels, and has a background in internal audit, credit risk and investment risk, but has also been involved heavily in operational risk since 2000, so since really the early days, and was formerly head of operational risk at ING Group and Lloyds Banking Group. And I think we've all we're all very well aware of Ariane's fantastic book, Operational Risk Management, Best Practices in the Financial Services Industry, which was released in December 2018 and became very quickly a #1 bestseller in its field. And then finally, last but not least, we have Simon Ashby, who's Professor of Financial Services at the Veric Business School in Belgium. And Simon has worked as an academic, a financial regulator, also had the pleasure of working with Simon at the FSA back in the day, and a senior operational risk manager in a number of financial institutions. And he focuses on training and consulting in risk management. And as I mentioned already, Simon is a fellow and former chairman of the IOR. So that's our speakers. In terms of the plan of action today, so we have Andrew will talk first and give a bit of an overview of the issues he raised in the paper that he published a few weeks ago now on LinkedIn, which was the inspiration really for the title here. And then Ariane will give her thoughts and her reflections on that. And then finally, Simon will give his thoughts. And then we will have some time for some discussion and for Q&A. So please submit your questions and I will put these to the speakers. So on that note, without further ado, I will ask Andrew to take over. Over to you, Andrew.
Thanks very much, Jimmy, and many thanks to the Institute for inviting me, first for inviting me to speak, and secondly, and most alarmingly, for trusting me with technology. I've managed to turn my mic on, so I've got the first bit right. The key point here, as Jimmy said, this isn't some esoteric argument about definitions of operational risk events, and I must admit I wasn't that familiar with grey rhinos before I started researching my paper. But the key point is you have to understand the type of issue that it was in order to understand some of the lessons that you need to learn. So what I'm going to focus on is on slide 5. I'm going to look at why this is important, look at whether COVID-19 is a black swan or not, because of course, if it was, then some of the lessons will be different. And then we're going to move over to lessons learned. So you could argue that if coronavirus is a black swan, that means we couldn't see it coming. We couldn't predict it. We couldn't establish preventative and detective controls, and this would excuse a lot of parties for failing to truly prepare for what is an unknown event. But of course, if it's not a black swan, then there's something wrong in our risk management framework, and that prevented us from seeing this event coming. And so if it's not a black swan, then quite clearly we need to be looking at our framework in order to understand what we need to be doing in the future to make sure that we can identify and mitigate events that we hadn't identified. And the interesting thing on slide 7 is from Nassim Nicholas Taleb's book, The Black Swan. And for those of you who don't know, this is all about before we discovered the Australia, people in the old world, which was kind of UK, were convinced all swans were white. And so we believed that swans were white, they couldn't possibly be black. And then we turn up in Australia, we sight a black swan. And so suddenly we've seen something that shows the limitation of our learning, and that our learning's based on observations and experience. And in fact, on the next slide, I list the 3 attributes that Taleb gives to a black swan. The first one, it's an outlier, as it lies outside our regular expectations. We can't expect it to happen. Nothing in the past has pointed to it happening. It carries an extreme impact because otherwise, we probably wouldn't be interested. And finally, because it's an outlier, human nature makes us come up with lots of explanations after the fact, making it explainable and predictable. And it's no great surprise that I've put in red there the point that to be a black swan, it has to be an outlier and lie outside the realm of regular expectations. So the question which I address on slide 9 is whether COVID-19 was a black swan. And I mean, the first point is quite simply that in 1918, 1957 and 1968, there were some Spanish flu pandemics, and the one that came at the end of the First World War, which was incorrectly or unfairly called Spanish flu. The explanation I heard was that it was called Spanish flu because the Spaniards didn't take part in the Second World War, and so it was an attempt to criticize them in some way. But certainly it didn't originate in Spain, and American troops coming to the UK was one of the factors that helped spread the influenza virus, and that killed 50 million people. 500 million people were infected, and you can't help but have seen over recent weeks pictures from that era, people, you know, in the streets, certainly not social distancing, some wearing masks. So, you know, a pandemic of this type, certainly a huge pandemic in 1918. I mean, 50 million, the impact of 50 million people dying is just huge. But we've also had other pandemics. We've had the SARS, which happened in 2002 and 2003. And that's estimated to have killed about 800 people. But I can certainly remember cancelling a holiday because of SARS. Although obviously we hadn't gone into lockdown or anything like that. I just wasn't sure I wanted to take my family on holiday. And then we have Ebola. Now, Ebola, the first epidemic was 2013, 2016. About 11,000 people died, some in Italy and some in the UK. And there is, in fact, an Ebola outbreak going on in 2018. When I'm thinking about these pandemics, I must admit the thought of something like Ebola hitting densely populated areas is really quite terrifying. If you have 28,000 people infected and 11,000 die, you know, I don't know what the rate of transmission is there. One of the interesting things that I discovered when I was looking at this was a TED talk by Bill Gates, and I'd recommend that you look at that. Because he's very clear. He starts with the picture of a nuclear explosion, and he says that war isn't the biggest threat to mankind, and it's actually the risk of a pandemic. So 4 years ago, you had a globally renowned person warning us of pandemics. The World Health Organization also identified coronavirus as one of the things that we should be concerned about in 2016. And since I published my paper, someone has pointed me towards Lloyd's market paper, Pandemic Potential Insurance Impacts. And actually, lots of other impacts, lots of other papers have been submitted. So really, we can't claim it's a black swan. We definitely had lots of warning. And I've come across this definition of something called a grey rhino by Michelle Wucker. And you can see the book there if you want to read more. And she defines a grey rhino as a highly probable, high impact yet neglected threat. So they're not random surprises, and they occur after a series of warnings and visible evidence. So based on what we saw on the previous slide, you could argue that the current pandemic is a grey rhino. Interestingly, there is also on YouTube an interview with Taleb, where he's asked if it's a black swan, and he's very clear that it isn't a black swan. He says it's a white swan. I guess in his world, things are either black or white, and so he's very clear that it's a white swan. So that's whether we should have been aware and pre-warned that this was coming, and therefore that impacts how we should learn the lessons from the crisis. So Jimmy, I'll pass the microphone back to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Andrew. So Ariane, can I ask you now to take through your slides?
Sure, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to work with you guys and to be able to give an input to the IOR. All right, so thank you very much, Andrew. And in your paper, you say some commentators have called COVID-19 a grey rhino. So I was very happy to be able to pull out the abstract of my yet edited article. I had a bit more of a radical version that has been edited out, but let's leave that for now. That I published on RiskNet not so long after the lockdown, and actually written 10 days before that, but the editing time. The editing was quite there, but I did call it a grey rhino, and I completely agree with Andrew's point on that. And so we said, however, and anticipating on the next slide, or introducing on the next slide, I think some CROs in banks have confirmed to them that they had pandemic on their risk register, but they had a black swan, and the black swan wasn't the pandemic itself, but was the response to the pandemic. And I'm actually I can relate very much to this view. So some banks have pandemic on their scenarios, but the effect was, let's assume that 30 people are unavailable to go to work, and we need to continue our plans with 70% people. None of the organization I talked to, doesn't mean none, but did not anticipate the knock-on effect on all the aspects. And for the sake of time, I will not go into detail here. But what I express on these slides is first of all, the interconnections between the different risks as they are published by the World Economic Forum every year. So that's the right-hand side of the slide. And interestingly, the World Economic Forum published their report on the 15th of January 2020. And the infectious disease is, if you can read, it's a little red dot on the upper left corner of the graph, with some remote connections with things like involuntary migration, social instability, unemployment, etc. When you look at the left-hand side of the graph, when I started listing in these boxes what we are living right now, so the distancing, the lockdown, the remote work, the fraud risk and the furlough worker, the cyber threats, and then that's more my pessimism, or some will call realism, talking, public debt, layoff, credit default, economic depressions, etc., etc. These are all the further risks or materializations that we can anticipate. So I would go for grey rhino as the pandemic, but to some extent a black swan in the response to that, and probably our need to look at a network of risks. Now, why did we miss it? And that's on slide 15. Some elements, but I'm very happy to take questions or to start the discussions later on with Simon and the others of you listening. Why did we miss it? Well, we're not very good at predicting. We know that. So we merely reproduce recent past, and so when SARS is even 10 years ago, or if only 10 years ago, and the Spanish flu 100 years ago, it all looks very distant, and we tend to discount that for the future. We have short memory. That's what I detail now. So one of the themes here is, what are the lessons? I think in terms of lessons, we clearly need to avoid, as risk manager, as much as possible the groupthink and the pro-cyclicality. So thinking what everybody thinks and just emphasizing the ups and downs, but rather be counter-cyclical, just like in investments, but that's a side comment. And look for blind spots. Be aware of models and anticipation. So try to use as different models and as different variety of input as possible. And along these lines as well, diversity is very important. Diversity not only in model, but in people, in input to go to decision making. So again, in the lessons, allow me in slide 16 to have a slide what I called what now. So what do we think? Okay, it's good to predict the past, or let me try to not to predict the future, well, sort of, but to anticipate the trends a little bit. threats have not gone away. So before COVID broke, everybody talked about climate change and extreme weather events and cyber risk. Now everybody talks about COVID. Does it mean that climate change, extreme weather events, or cyber threat have gone away? Quite the opposite, actually. We all heavily rely on technology, as we just experienced now and every day. But you have other risks that have increased. So migration and international tensions were in great before COVID. I don't expect to get any lower after that. And then economic depression, social unrest, and then if they decide to monetize the debt, which is an elegant way to say we're going to print notes to fund what we're promising now, the economist in me anticipate a bad inflation. So yeah, call me a pessimist. So that's some of the, and on slide 17, thank you. So again, in terms of what can we do, these are very large problems. I'll come with other possible grey rhinos in a minute, but large problems require different types of interventions, of course. And here I suggest 3 at state level, organizational level, and personal level. So depending on where you are, and if some of you are in the government, and I have the pleasure, well, actually after this call, I have a call with some members of the US government, so I'm very excited about that. But how can we have a different level of influence, whether it's at government level or in organization, to address these threats? So at state level, we're looking at regulation and international cooperation, something I'd like to insist upon. And very rightly, Andrew attracted my attention to Bill Gates and mentioned it. And Bill Gates, besides being well known for trying to eradicate polio and investing in vaccines, the Gates Foundation is the largest private funder now in the research to the vaccine against COVID. He's also working in innovation in nuclear energy. And in general, innovation is one of the most promising area to fix climate change, or to help alleviating the terrible impact that we can rightly anticipate on climate change. And at organizational level, which is probably most relevant to many of you listening, is really looking at the interrelations between risk. I know Simon will talk about that as well. And so really renovating a little bit, or updating the way we're looking at especially operational risk, rather than looking at it in silos, one risk and then another, but really have this portfolio approach that people have in financial risk management as well. And then at personal level, in the article I was referring to on RiskNet, I talk about the paradox of underestimation of risk at global level, but overestimation at personal level. We've all observed the disruption to supply chain at Sainsbury's, of Tesco's, of goods as puzzling as toilet paper. Why toilet paper break down in a COVID-19 crisis is still completely baffles me. But and that's also a manifestation of the lack of risk savviness, I'd say, or risk education in a general population. And so finally, I want to finish also on what are the grey rhinos potentially that we are seeing now. 2 different things, and it's very biased by my personal experience and contact. One is quantum computing, and I've commented on that in previous conferences. But one of my research consultants is one of my former best students, and she's also part of a PhD at the Department of Computer Science at UCL, where I teach. And quantum computing is a technology of calculation capacity of computers that are not operational yet. It's almost science fiction. Let's say it's prototyping. But when this will be on the market, you can kiss goodbye a lot of cyber protection. And some of the sources and indirect sources I heard saying that only one bank in the world, and I don't know which one, I assume one, but I don't know for sure, is taking that seriously and looking at it. The other one is like, basically, we cross that bridge when we get there. Personally, that makes me a bit nervous. And the other one is nuclear energy. I had a client near old nuclear power plant, and reading the report on the the overdue decommissioning of some nuclear power plant make me nervous. Let's say that's the global one. And then for organization, the groupthink and diversity, I think, is still lacking, not only on boards, but in a lot of senior management of large organizations. And I'm not necessarily targeting financial sector, I'm talking in general here. Whistleblowing channel and groupthink as well. And then from a purely operational perspective, investing in skills and in people's education. Now, of course, the teacher in me feels that very, very strongly, and in training. And so on that note, because I don't want to take too much time, I'm happy to leave the floor to another teacher, also in my country now, in Belgium, Professor Ashby.
Thanks, Ariane. Over to you, Simon.
Thanks, Jimmy, and good afternoon, everybody. Actually, I'm currently stuck. Well, I don't think stuck is quite the word, but stuck in Cornwall, because we were over here before the kind of lockdowns began, and so here we've stayed. But it looks like we can get back to Belgium sometime soon, which is good news. So good afternoon, everybody. I want to focus more on solutions to grey rhinos. And of course, you know, both Andrew and Ariane have talked about events that have occurred previously, including, of course, the so-called Spanish flu. I heard it was called Spanish flu because the Spanish government was the only government that actually reported it. Other governments kept it secret because they didn't want to worry their populations while they were at war. But anyway, I think, you know, everyone's got a different story about that pandemic. As it's already been said, we've really had the same old problems. You know, pandemics are nothing new, but of course we do live in a very different world now, a world of social media. We have different attitudes to life and to safety. That word safe, for example, I think the meaning behind, or the meaning people assign to that word, is very different now than what it was back, say, in 1920, or even I think back in those kind of you know, 2003, 2004, when we had SARS. So same old problems, but a very different world in which we find ourselves. And I'm not going to talk about it now, but there's some interesting work done on something called a transboundary crisis. And rather like a pandemic infects one person and then, of course, moves on to other people, potentially in an exponential way. With transboundary crises, they start in one sphere, say the natural world, and then, of course, they spread into business, into economics, into financial markets, and that's very much where we are. I've just been writing a piece for a newspaper on the crisis, and it struck me that one way to think about it is we're all on a roller coaster at the moment, but crucially we're on the roller coaster blindfolded. We don't know how far we're going to fall, and we don't know if and when we're going to kind of get back up again. And that's certainly how it feels to me, and I'm definitely not a big fan of roller coasters. So anyway, let's move on to solutions. So I think the first thing I would say is it's important that we are not chicken. And I'm not talking here about a gung-ho kind of Trumpian inject yourself with disinfectant kind of response. Far from it. In fact, you know, chickens, in fact, I noticed that there's been a rise in people keeping chickens as a result of the pandemic, because of course they provide eggs. Well, unfortunately, because we divide our time between the UK and Belgium, we can no longer keep chickens, because I'm pretty sure the Eurostar wouldn't take too kindly to us bringing live chickens with us. But chickens as an animal can either be very kind of, if you like, Trumpian in their response to things, so very kind of gung-ho, take excessive amounts of risk. At other times, they can be extremely risk averse, avoiding any kind of risk or hazard. Now, of course, both responses, an extreme kind of, if you like, safety response versus an extreme kind of risk-taking response, can be destructive. And organisations, I think, as we emerge from lockdown around the world, organisations need to remember not to be chickens. They must avoid either extreme safety responses and also extreme kind of risk-taking responses as well, finding, of course, the appropriate balance for their organisation and their staff. And I think it's going to be really cool, really important to remember that, grey rhinos, like any other situation, can be managed. There are already, in relation to the pandemic, for example, known ways in which we can fight it, and our information is increasing all the time. Wearing of masks if you have the infection, for example, appears to be very important, as well as kind of hand washing, disinfecting surfaces rather than people, and so on. So I think organisations, most of us will have, of course, a risk appetite and a risk appetite statement, but have we thought about that in the context of COVID-19 or indeed other grey rhinos? Probably not, because as Andrew says, by definition, we haven't considered those risks or not thought of them to be perhaps as significant as they might be. So I think step number one is to think about appetite. Sensitive subject. I'm sure some people's blood pressure is rising, even as I'm saying that. But I think it's important to remember in relation to any situation, including the situation we find ourselves in now, there is no such thing as 100% safety. We do seem to be in a situation where that word safe has emerged as perhaps meaning the absence of risk, which of course we all know as risk managers is impossible. It's about, of course, identifying the level that's appropriate for the achievement both of people's personal objectives, but also, of course, organisational objectives as well. So not just for COVID-19, but for other grey rhinos, think about your appetite for those risks, talk about them, reflect on what you would do and what's appropriate for your organisation. Okay, so that's just thought number one in terms of how to go about it. Thought number two, I think we've seen already in relation to the pandemic, increased amounts of creative thinking. I was watching today, I know Ariane's in Belgium at the moment, and they were talking about how they're reopening schools in Belgium, and of course schools have been open in Denmark for some time. And you hear people talking in the UK about reopening schools, very concerned about it, not really thinking how that could be possible. But when you look to what's being done in Denmark, while you look to what's being done in Belgium now, it shows that there are things you can do. Even small children, believe it or not, can actually understand, if it's presented appropriately, concepts like social distancing, for example, having defined groups of children playing together, so that if they do spread the virus, of course, it's only spread within a very small number of people, and obviously appropriate PPE and so on. So creative solutions, I think, there does need to be in organisations a bit of a can-do spirit when it comes to this. We've seen it, I'm just using it as an example that's close to me, but I've seen it a bit in universities. Clearly, the university model of large lectures, I think, is probably not something we're going to see for some time. You can, of course, say, well, then we cannot have universities, but universities are already embracing technologies like Zoom, Microsoft Teams. I mean, I think, like many of us, I'm fast becoming an expert in these solutions. At Vlerick, for example, we're now developing more and more online material, doing executive education online, doing our masters and MBA teaching online, and I know that other universities, are beginning to think about these things too. So there are ways in which we can find solutions to the problems that we are facing now. And this slide here, in terms of principled and prescriptive, I think what I would say here is this is from research that we did looking at risk management in the boardroom for the Association of Chartered Certified Accountants, and we learned there about two types of organisation, two types of board: a more prescriptive approach, which you tend to see more in financial services, where I know many of us come from, versus a more principled approach. And I think this is again something we're going to need to see in organizations. A prescriptive approach doesn't work well in an environment like COVID-19. You know, when you're faced with something you didn't think you were going to face, then a prescriptive approach can of course fail very quickly, because probably your policies and procedures simply don't cover the situation that you're in now. With a more kind of principled approach, a more outward looking, a more kind of discussive, a more kind of integrating risk into the bigger discussions within the organization type approach, then people can probably be more responsive and will find solutions you know, more quickly, and will come to terms with a changing environment, and are more likely to adapt to a new normal rather than just try to force the situation back to where they were before. So let's move on then to my kind of well, final key thought. I don't know if anybody's seen the film. I'm a big fan of kind of zombie movies, and there's one movie called World War Z that my wife hates. I have to kind of watch it when she's not around. But one of the reasons I like this movie, and of course the pandemic that you see in World War Z is far worse than, luckily, than we're experiencing now. But they have a situation. It's the city of Jerusalem, in fact, and they had the 10th person principle. I'm afraid it was the 10th man principle, but I'm politically correcticizing it. So they had the kind of the 10th person principle, and the idea was that if everybody thought the same in their kind of ruling council, it was the duty of the 10th person to think differently. And as a result of this, in this particular film, the city of Jerusalem is the only place that's not overrun by these zombies, because they were able to effectively quarantine themselves against the oncoming threat more quickly. And I think that just again, it just shows the importance there of collective thinking, but collective thinking that avoids groupthink, that you are open to different ideas and different perspectives. So as organizations, as businesses, you know, reopen, I think it's going to be important to have conversations amongst the management team and with wider staff really about, you know, what should we do? How should we go about this? Encourage a broad range of ideas, and crucially encourage different perspectives, because if everybody comes at it from the same point of view, then it's probably not going to work very effectively. And again, there I just have bring in the concept of risk intelligence. Sorry, Jimmy, I was just I think Jimmy's given me signal that I need to move on. But just quickly mention this concept of risk intelligence, having people in your organization with building on Ariane's point about diversity, having a diverse range of perspectives, a diverse range of knowledge, diverse backgrounds. So that's of course, yes, gender, but also age, social kind of background, education, and so on. I think, you know, again, we're going to see the importance of that so that we can come up with effective ideas. And then that brings me on just to my kind of final thought. I mean, we've seen, and quite understandably, of course, very understandably, we've had governments taking some very significant steps to try and manage the pandemic, including effectively stopping the heart of many economies. And I think now, as we emerge, hopefully, from kind of lockdown, we need to remember, of course, that reducing one risk can create others. By not doing one thing, we create risks elsewhere. And I think organizations need to be very aware of that, you know, as well. So don't be like that lamb, you know, attack, well, not attack, I don't want to use that word, but understand, accept that you are going to be exposed to a range of risks, including some new or unfamiliar risks that you hadn't really estimated before, and be ready to balance those with the older risks that you face. Okay, so I think that's enough for me. We probably should move on to questions now, but please do, if you want to continue the conversation, get in touch with me at Blerick.
That's great. Thanks very much, Simon and Ariane and Andrew. So now we're on to questions. So we've got a few questions that have come through from you. So let me go through those. So the first one I wanted to ask is around whether the response to COVID-19 has demonstrated a failure of risk management, and if so, what are the failures? And obviously this is key in terms of learning the lessons to identify the failures first. So Andrew, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think it's so. When I think of the answer to this, I'm talking solely about the response. So we're forgetting about the bit, you know, should we have seen this coming? And one of the things that I think is quite interesting and actually quite ironic for someone who spent 40 years, 45 years in risk management for financial institutions, and then retired a year ago, suddenly, you know, this is risk management's time. If risk management cannot justify its existence and make contribution to the organisations, then that's the failure. And so I think from what we've seen of organisations and the way that they've responded, I think that that risk management has actually done very well. Because I take to heart the point Ariane was making. You know, we should have. It can be claimed we should have seen the pandemic coming. Did we necessarily envisage a pandemic with some of the impacts that we've seen? Then maybe not. And if I look at the way in which organisations have managed the risks that have come out of that and how quickly they've done so, I think organisations have managed this risk very, very well. And I'm aware of a number of organisations who, prior to the pandemic, simply did not have the technical ability for what now seems very simple, which is for everybody to work from home. And now that's very much the norm in financial institutions. A lot of organisations didn't have the digitalisation platforms that they needed for their staff, for their customers, and they've now resolved those. A lot of organisations where they have, you know, quite people-intensive activities and things like call centres have actually done a good job of dealing with the risks that are covered in there. So I don't think the response demonstrates a failure of risk management. I think the response, the way in which we've dealt with this, particularly when you look at the timeline, and we were all at the masterclass that the IOR put on resilience, which was ahead of the lockdown. And at that stage, people were talking about blue teaming it and red teaming it and those sorts of things. And really, organisations and the risk management functions have come a long way since that time. So no, I think for most organisations, the response has been a success. But I don't know if Ariane or Simon disagree with me.
Ariane, any thoughts?
Thank you. Yeah, no, I completely agree. There's an echo, but in just a side comment. No, I think it could have been a lot worse. I'm still amazed to see how the payment system, if I think of financial services, the payment system, the online banking works, how the supply chain, even in the great distribution, in the retail distribution that has been so disrupted, recovered. I'm not talking about PPE and all that. I'm talking about Sainsbury's, retail goods, etc., and delivery companies still operating the way they were. So I think the resilience, including the resilience of the technology, of course, is good. It's good news. Good news.
Yeah, I think. Thanks, Jimmy. Yeah, I think the key issue for me is what we saw was organisations prepared to do things and prepared to make decisions, even sometimes when, you know, governments weren't. You know, organisations were already, you know, whether it was finding new distribution channels, whether it was looking to find, you know, alternative suppliers. You know, even for example, motor manufacturers in the UK actually implemented their no-deal Brexit plan for the pandemic, because of course they've done a lot of planning for that. And of course, a lot of components that they use come from China, for example, and they've been busy kind of storing up components because they were aware of kind of lead time issues. So even while that, you know, factories have been closed, they've been storing up components so that when they can get back to production, which presumably will now, at least in England, start quite soon, you know, they could be up and running, you know, immediately. So yeah, I think you could talk about just in time and say, oh, these things aren't resilient. Well, organizations found a way around it, and it is about being prepared to make those decisions and to find creative solutions.
That's great, thank you. So we got a really good question, which I think is a particularly good one for former regulators. So some would argue that regulators already had responses to extreme events in their rear mirror, and quotes the consultations on operational resilience that are currently active. Could it be a case of regulation coming too late to prepare us for the crisis? And then even more controversially, in brackets, as was the case with Basel II. How about taking that one, Andrew?
Sorry, Jimmy, that's the technology passing me by completely. That's a lovely question, and I should say before I start to answer it, I didn't ask it. Let's recognise that it's always difficult being a regulator, and so some of these things are always in the rear mirror. Regulators are often on the back foot; they're often responding. Did the regulation on resilience come too late? Well, as I say, it's difficult to predict these things, but don't forget the Bank of England in 2017, Charlotte Gherkin was talking about operational resilience. And the interesting thing, so I think the Bank of England would say, no, they didn't come too late. And one of the reasons they would say they didn't is because the paper that they presented assumes that events will happen, and it's all about dealing with it. So actually, and I do have a slight problem with this, but I think the central bank is agnostic to the sort of issue that arose. So I think that did it come too late? Maybe not. Did Basel come too late? I kind of argued with Basel that the 2007 financial crisis actually came too early, and certainly, and I guess it's at the nub of this question, life's always easier if there's a reasonable gap between new rules and requirements being implemented and them actually being used in anger. One of the interesting things about operational resilience is, and nobody would have wanted this scenario, but people are having to bench test their arrangements now. They're having to bench test them live, they're having to change them and adapt them. The other thing is, this isn't just a matter for regulators. So regulators' job is to kind of try and keep firms honest and to make them do the things that they need to do for safety, in the prudential regulations example, for safety and soundness of firms, financial conduct authority for customers and for financial markets. But there is also a responsibility for organizations here. So if the regulatory response came too late, then the organizational response, almost by definition, if nothing was being done, which is why the regulator had to intervene, then the problem probably lies as much with the organization. But I think one of the interesting things that comes from this, and it is somewhere where I do have an issue with the proposals that we've seen from the regulator, is it's to do with how you roll out operational resilience within organizations. And it may be this is something we'll come on to in a later question. But certainly I was intrigued. I was talking to someone yesterday from an industry body, and they said that their firms that had an integrated operational resilience framework had dealt much better with the pandemic. And of course, that's one of the gaps that I think we have in the current proposals, that the proposal isn't for an integrated framework. So, you know, maybe there's more that the bank could have done, that the regulators could have done. The interesting thing, of course, is I'm effectively, I guess, defending the PRA and the Bank of England and the FCA. And don't forget that our regulators are quite some way ahead of other regulators and the Basel Committee and its working group. So life would have been nicer if things had been developed earlier, but the messages were certainly there for firms, and you kind of can't blame the regulator, because it's down to the firm, its management and its board to make sure that that protects the individual firm. So that's my kind of thoughts, Jimmy.
Thanks, Andrew. And just on that point about the operational resilience consultation, it's worth saying that one of our future webinars will actually be to go through the IOR's response to those consultations, in which we do make the argument around the need for an integrated approach to operational resilience. So that's one definitely to look out for. Here is a question, another question from the audience. I think good one for Ariane. How would an organisation prioritise grey rhinos?
I think in terms of, let me think for a second. No, that's all right. I have my answer. I think when I work with firms on scenario analysis, my take or my advice is look at the potential impact for you. Don't trust your estimates of likelihood. We are notoriously bad at assessing what type of risk we're facing. I think assessing the impact of what it could mean for us in terms of business discontinuity, and we talked about resilience, is a bit more reliable or easier to quantify, because you can base yourself to your data and your business reality. So I'd say, you know, look at your exposure to some of the grey rhinos, and take it from there and prioritize that way, rather than gambling on the likelihood of an event.
Okay, that's great. I got another question, I think, for Simon this time, which because it relates to one of the points you made. So, in relation to your chicken response and the tolerability of risk, how should organisations deal with employees perceived and unions that have a very high risk perception and will be reluctant to return to work?
Yeah, I mean, that's the kind of $6 million question. I think the first thing to say with this is that everybody perceives risk differently, and their perception of risk is real. There's no one right perception. You know, scientists still have a perception, as does risk professionals. I think the important thing is to listen to their concerns and to show that you're not ignoring them. But I think it's also very reasonable to say, look, you know, there are the following activities or controls we know to be effective against COVID-19. The key one being, of course, hand washing, but also, of course, where potentially people are infected, wearing masks, and of course social distancing. So there may be a need, for example, to restructure office spaces so that people aren't, for example, working face to face. Maybe also about still allowing or encouraging people to work from home where they possibly can. Very possible for people like me that's an academic. I accept that's not possible for everybody in every context, but it's still something you can do so that you can keep the numbers of people in an office space to a safe amount. I think the other thing I know some organisations are talking about is testing their staff. So getting hold of testing kits and testing their staff, for example, every 2 weeks to see whether they have the virus. So that's another thing that you know that could be explored. I think ultimately, you know, where and there is now this acknowledging of coronaphobia. If you're dealing with a kind of extreme coronaphobic response, I think it's about saying, look, we are taking the following steps. We feel that they are safe. And of course, we're following government advice, or we're following WHO advice. I think so long as you are doing that, then you do need to be, put your foot down to a degree, I think. I was listening to a guy from a bus union saying that, that none, that safe meant 100% safe. Well, that is clearly impossible. So I think you do have to have those conversations. But I think there are solutions that can be done to make workplaces as safe as possible in view of the current situation.
That's great. Thank you, Simon. So Ariane, I think this is a good question for you, again, from the audience. Do you think that the loss of revenue, opportunity cost, should be considered operational risk losses from this event?
It's a good question. Yeah, I would say I'm thinking of my firm when I'm thinking that. Yeah, yes, I definitely an indirect effect. Yes, absolutely. And between ourselves also preparing these webinar and with other circles, of course, it's a large debate on the economic cost of all this. And interestingly, Simon was talking about risks that change in nature, transient risk, I think. Can't pronounce that in English properly. No, well, not really boundary, but a risk that change in nature, and it's we also mentioned OR Hex, but a summary I heard from Luc at OR Hex, Luc Harivik, he said, well, people tend to say now that whereas the great financial crisis, the subprime crisis, was a credit risk that turned operational risk with all the conduct aspects, etc. COVID is an operational risk that will turn into a credit risk and a credit crisis. I think the knock-on effect of COVID we're only starting to see, and there's all the papers coming up now about the greatest shrink in GDP in ever, pretty much, here in the UK, and it's only starting. So the indirect effect of this crisis will be massive. And I do think, going back to the network slide I presented, it will reinforce the need to look at risks in a portfolio manner and look a lot more at the interactions and the interdependencies that what we've done so far in our risk assessment and mitigation response as well. Simon mentioned that by responding to one risk, we can create others, and that's exactly what we've done with COVID. We've responded very heavily on a sanitary impact and discounted heavily all the other impacts, and the debate for rebalance will only be growing from now, I suspect.
Thanks, Ariane. We're almost out of time, but I think we have time maybe for a couple more questions. So one question: what has the COVID-19 experience taught us about the general understanding, perhaps in the wider population and within government, of risk? And the thought comes to mind that we have within the scientific sphere. We had Richard Dawkins made the Professor of Public Understanding of Science. I wonder whether we need something similar for risk after this experience. Maybe to Simon.
Yes, absolutely. I'm ready with my application. Yeah, I think it is a real key. It's a real issue because everybody is looking at this risk very differently. I see that in my own just little small community here in North Cornwall. Some people that refuse to go outside versus people who aren't even remotely concerned about it. And I should stress that that includes medical professionals who aren't even remotely concerned about it. So it's not about knowledge of necessarily of the virus or the medical issues. I think it is a key issue. I think governments have quite rightly focused on making people afraid so that they, of course, obey the lockdown measures. And we do know from looking at places like China and New Zealand that they can work if they're done for short periods of time. But of course, the problem is that you're so successful with that then people are sort of scared to, to come out afterwards. So I think I would hope that we look at that, and I think it's the same in organisations, really having that conversation about what is risk, but also understand both the negatives but also the positives about risk and about risk taking. I hope that comes out from this too.
Andrew, any thoughts?
Oh, hello, Jimmy. Sorry, it seems to be taking me forever to unmute my mic. I think that there is a need for an understanding, because I think there is a real danger that there's no trade-off, and the COVID-19 risk is seen in a kind of very black and white way, and other speakers have talked about the fact that there are things that you have to play off, different values, different forces. Quite clearly at some stage there's going to have to be decisions made. We're kind of moving towards this between the state of the economy and our response to COVID-19, because of course the health of the economy will determine our ability to reduce the cost of COVID-19, the financial cost of COVID-19, but also the period that we have to pay the COVID-19 bills. So I think one of the things that worries me, and I'm afraid I've stopped watching the BBC News at 5 o'clock or whenever, because I kept shouting at the television, is the fact I think there isn't in the public space, and actually in the government space, I don't think there's a proper understanding of risk. And I think that that's influencing some of the decisions that we're seeing and that are impacting us all.
Ariane, finally, your thoughts from you?
No, I agree. I like the question very much, and the need for risk literacy is absolutely necessary. Even at schools, I think secondary schools need to be taught the essentials of finance, savings, money and business, but also risk, because as we all know, as risk managers, it impacts every aspect of our private life and business life. So it is absolutely essentials. And if that crisis brings this, at least a little bit, that will be one of the positive aspects.
Yeah, and that's a very good argument for getting children back to school as soon as possible. Okay, so I think we've actually run out of time, gone a bit over, but I'd like to finish there and start firstly by thanking the speakers, Simon, Ariane and Andrew, for a really interesting session. And then thanking all of you who joined and engaged by asking some really good and some quite difficult questions. And just finally, I'd say watch out for notifications in your email inboxes for our next webinars. And we look forward to you joining then. Okay, thank you very much. Bye-bye.